The White House to Congress this afternoon. This is war. The White House declaring Don McGahn's documents, Donald Trump's taxes, the unredacted Mueller report, and possibly Robert Mueller himself off limits for Congress. It's the administration's most blatant and aggressive set of moves to obstruct congressional oversight of the executive branch. The news breaking this afternoon that the White House is reserving its right to exert executive privilege over former White House counsel Don McGahn's documents. McGahn emerged as Robert Mueller's star witness in the obstruction of justice investigation, in which he is cited more than any other witness. Today, he finds himself caught in the crossfire between the White House and Congress, which could lead him to face a contempt citation for refusing a subpoena from Congress for his documents. New York Times reporting today, quote, the White House's stance increases pressure on Mr. McGahn, a crucial witness both to Mr. Mueller and to House Democrats investigating abuse of power and obstruction of justice, to ultimately decide whether to defy Mr. Trump and cooperate with the committee or hold the administration's line. And the fight over McGahn, not the only front on which the White House is fighting Congress. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's refusal to turn over Donald Trump's taxes to Congress is a standoff now likely to end up in the Supreme Court, while the fight over an unredacted copy of the Mueller report may result in a contempt citation for the Attorney General. William Barr would become the second Attorney General in U.S. history to be found in contempt if Congress takes that extraordinary step tomorrow. And that is where we start today, the state of the standoff, joined by some of our favorite reporters and friends. Here with us in New York, NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. It's a treat to have her, as well as former federal prosecutor for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, Barrett Berger, plus former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi, and Mike Schmidt, Washington correspondent for the New York Times, whose byline is on that piece of reporting about Don McGahn's documents. Mike Schmidt, we'll start with you. What are you guys reporting about the White House posture? Former White House counsel Don McGahn's testimony and availing himself and his documents to Congress.
Well, the White House is basically saying, hey, the documents that McGahn has are ours. They're protected by executive privilege, and Congress, you need to come through us. You can't go to McGahn. It's a legalistic thing that is not important to the larger picture, which is the fact that here's another impediment in the way of Democrats. This is something that is going to slow down their ability to get new information, to get things to investigate. They want to use the Mueller report as a launching off point to look at these issues about abuse of power, obstruction of justice, witness tampering. But when the White House says that the witnesses can't talk, they're in a difficult spot, because where do they turn? All they have is Mueller and the report, and they don't have a McGahn to sit down and talk to bring before Congress. And I think what you see today is how they will handle McGahn's testimony. The White House will try and stop that as well. And whatever it is, it will prolong, it will slow down any type of momentum the Democrats think they have.
It's dangerous to get any legal analysis off Twitter, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway, Mike Schmidt. What about the idea that the White House has already waived executive privilege by allowing Don McGahn to spend 30 hours with Robert Mueller, talking to him, sharing his chief of staff, Annie Donaldson's contemporaneous notes about everything that went down in that sordid West Wing?
Well, I think what the White House would say to that is the difference between intra and inter-branch sharing. And in the case of the Mueller investigation, Mueller was part of the executive branch. So if the White House shared stuff with Mueller, it stayed within the executive. In this case, you're bringing in Congress, which is a different branch. And what the White House would say is that they did not waive privilege by sharing it within its own branch. So a little bit complicated, but basically the fact that Mueller ultimately was part of the Justice Department answers to the president, is the reason that allows the White House to make the argument that they haven't gone outside the branch and they haven't pierced the privilege. Now, the Democrats would say that's ridiculous because Mueller has made it public. It's already a public document. It's out there in a way that's far different than just sort of quietly sharing it with an investigator. It's a different situation.
Frank Figliuzzi, I'm going to hit you with Shakespeare here. They doth protesteth too much. I mean, the Mueller report has been delivered to Congress, no?
Right. The president's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to say, look, I ordered everybody to cooperate with the special counsel. They were interviewed for hours and hours. And now, by the way, I don't want anybody to really hear what they said. And that's a serious problem. Nicole, it's not overly dramatic to say that we're about to watch a possible redefinition of what it means to have three equal branches of government. We're about to watch the possible reshaping of the American presidency, and we're going to learn what congressional oversight is going to look like moving into the future. And at the center of that is going to be the Supreme Court. That's where all of this is going to be headed, in an environment where the Attorney General, the Secretary of Treasury are going to hold up a contempt of Congress citations as badges of honor. And this is playing out before our very eyes. We're watching American history unfold here.
Let me just follow up with you on that, Frank. And it would seem that we're watching I'm old enough to recognize patterns here. And the pattern that I recognize is that obstruction wasn't just what Donald Trump tried to do to Robert Mueller. Obstruction is the code by which he governs. He's now obstructing the Congress's very efforts to their constitutionally mandated oversight function.
Yeah, it's a philosophy of, if you are not my ally, you must be my enemy. There is no in between. But here's, again, what's troubling so many of us in the law enforcement and legal world that have spent careers in the Justice Department. We expect a president to be partisan. He's a politician. That's how we got there. Occasionally, we're going to get presidents that we just severely disagree with, but they're going to move on. But when it comes to the Attorney General of the United States, that is almost a sacrosanct position over our Justice Department. And to see that role denigrated into a partisan role where they're representing a president, to many of us, is the most troubling part of this scenario.
Let me ask you to pick up on that. I mean, the denigration of the rule of law seems to be what inspired nearly 700 former DOJ and former federal prosecutors to sign on to a letter saying that if Donald Trump were anyone but the president of the United States, he would now be an indicted conspirator here.
Right, and I think exactly. I think the idea behind that is just to say, leaving politics out of this. Many of these former prosecutors themselves have charged obstruction cases with fact patterns that are not dissimilar to that which Robert Mueller laid out in the report. So the idea is, this is not because the facts here wouldn't justify a prosecution. This is solely because this president is president. That's the reason he's not being prosecuted here. So I think it's a way to say, look, the rule of law actually would support prosecution here for anyone else who didn't have sort of the benefit of this OLC memo protecting them here.
Kristen, the White House is making arguments that seem to be rooted in, among these sort of legal arguments, also the president's fear of the optics of this. The president watched Christine Blasey Ford and was not unmoved by what he described as a performance that she gave in her testimony that came before Kavanaugh's. It seems that one of the things driving the White House's moves, at least from the president, would be his fear of the optics of Don McGahn on Capitol Hill, the optics of Robert Mueller on Capitol Hill, because McGahn's testimony, most of it you can read in the actual Mueller report or its footnotes.
I think that hits the nail on the head to a large extent, Nicole, because think about the optics, not just with Christine Blasey Ford, Michael Cohen. President Trump was overseas on a diplomatic trip, and it sucked all of the oxygen out of what he was doing overseas and put the focus on these actions that Michael Cohen said the president had taken, some of which he said crossed a legal line. So he's concerned about that. And frankly, he sees this as politically energizing for his base. If he looks embattled, if he looks like he's taking incoming fire on all fronts over his taxes, over Don McGahn, his former White House counsel, over special counsel Robert Mueller testifying. We haven't heard Mueller speak, really, since he started this investigation. Think about what those optics would look like. This allows him to not only fight this legal battle to try to run out the clock, Nicole, as he heads onto the 2020 campaign trail, but to make that case to his constituents as he heads out onto the trail to say, look, I'm an embattled president. All the more reason why you should support me.
Mike Schmidt, this brings us full circle to something you've reported as a Rudy Giuliani strategy throughout the duration of the Mueller investigation, that it was all about politics for them. It also, if you sort of peel back the onion a little bit, it suggests they're worried about what his actions might sound like when broadcast on television. What is the degree of alarm? How much pressure is on the president's White House counsel and on the lawyers at DOJ to prevent all these things from happening, to prevent McGahn from ever testifying, to prevent Mueller from telling the story of what's already available in an obstruction report that they're relying on people not actually reading?
Well, the thing about Giuliani is when Giuliani came in a year ago now, he made this calculation that this was just a political problem. And that has basically turned out to be right, as the president does not have any legal exposure here now that he's been cleared, at least by the Justice Department. Now, folks would say maybe another Justice Department would come after he's president and could bring charges. But at least for now, it is all political. And sort of the way that they are fighting this now is similar to how they have done things over the past year. The idea was to muddy the waters, throw a lot of stuff at the wall, make things confusing, make them difficult for people to understand, make them appear political. And now they're basically saying, look, Mueller did his work. Why do they need to continue to investigate? This is ridiculous. We did all this cooperation. The president cooperated more. I mean, that's not really an accurate, characterization when the White House says the president says he cooperated. I mean, he didn't sit for an interview. But this is raw politics here, and the thing that really helps them is that the Republicans have stayed with them. If you watch the Barr hearing and Barr's testimony, every single one of those Republicans were all on the same page.
Frank Figliuzzi, if you watch the Barr hearings, you also saw the Attorney General lie about the contents and the substance of the Mueller report, particularly around some of the flashpoints involving Don McGahn. Let me just put some of those up for everyone to be reminded. What Don McGahn, if he were to testify before Congress, could describe in the court of public opinion, the one where Donald Trump actually seems to feel real fear, is the investigation into Mike Flynn, the context between the president and Jim Comey around that, public denials or requests to correct the record on the president asking for Mueller to be removed. This seems like a complicated story to read in a footnote of a report. But, Frank, we should just describe what that is. I mean, this is another case where if he were anybody else, I think it'd be called witness tampering, right? Or asking someone to falsify an account because the actual truth would constitute obstruction of justice. Talk about what that might sound like to a television audience.
Well, as hundreds of prosecutors have already said in writing, it's essentially a slam dunk on at least charging obstruction. And if the American people were to actually hear this play out in their living rooms, at home, on television, they'd be hearing a very credible witness or a series of witnesses explain exactly what they were directed to do by the President of the United States. They would hear the moral and ethical dilemmas they placed these people that they were placed in by the president. They would hear the pushing back that went on against the president, and it would be almost irrefutable evidence. So when you contrast that with how the Attorney General has depicted all of that and simply said it's not there, the president's been totally exonerated, there would be such a gap, such a delta between reality and what the Attorney General has said that the American people would feel compelled to do something about it. And I think that's what has put great fear into this White House. Even, I think, as early as this morning, Kellyanne Conway saying, well, everybody's read the report. We don't need to hear it again. Well, Nicole, I can assure you, most of America has not read the report. And that's exactly why we all need to hear it and hear it soon.
Frank, you and I should read that report to them. There's a podcast in us somewhere. Let me ask you, Barrett. This is from, and I guess the point is, whenever the White House jumps up and down, screams the loudest, and sends letters from the White House counsel's office and DOJ, it's just a tell. It's a tell that they are terrified of something happening. So here's something that is straight out of the Mueller report that Don McGahn, I imagine, would be asked about. From the Mueller report, Saturday Night Massacre, McGahn's clear recollection was that the president directed him to tell Rosenstein, who was then overseeing the investigation, not only that conflicts existed, but also that Mueller has to go. Mueller spoke with the president twice and understood the directive the same way both times. In response to that request, McGahn decided to quit because he did not want to participate in events that he described as akin to the Saturday Night Massacre. massacre. He told Reince Priebus, he was the chief of staff, I don't know, 4 ago, that the president asked him to do crazy SHIT and inform Priebus and Bannon that he was leaving. I mean, you cannot overstate the potential to change the politics, as Mike and Kristen are talking about the White House putting all their eggs in the political basket. If someone who was a lifelong Republican, who was loyal to Donald Trump while he worked there, tells this story of being asked to fire Mueller and being told to do crazy bleep.
Well, and we all know that it is so much more powerful to hear a live witness testify, to tell you a story, than to read about it in the Mueller report, assuming people actually have read the Mueller report. To have
Can we stop assuming that anyone's read the Mueller report except the 6 of us? I mean, that's it.
Exactly. And I'm not even sure about all of us yet. But to have Don McGahn on the stand, not only to tell the story, but to have follow-up questions, right? To get to sort of probe all of the contours of that story would be incredibly powerful, would shed light on how sort of the inner workings of the White House were going on at this time. You have to imagine that Don McGahn was present to conversations that would, quite frankly, shock the American people, I think, to hear him describe them, that would lay out this picture of this sort of systematic pattern of obstruction that we've read about in the report. But hearing it, I think, would be dramatically different.
And if you look at all the people who've laid a glove on this president, if you track his historically low poll numbers to their lowest points, even for an historically unpopular president, they all track with Republicans taking him on. The anonymous op-ed came out about a week after Bob Woodward's book Fear had all these insider accounts. The Mattis resignation at the end of the year last year. The high-level resignations from within the president's team are where he always takes the biggest body blows to his political strength, if you can call it that.
And you almost get the sense that he's absorbing the enormity of what this might look like in real time. I asked him on Friday if he thinks Mueller should testify, and he said, well, that's up to the attorney general. And then
I'd leave it up to him, too.
Well, right. But then a day later, he changed his mind on Twitter and said, actually, he shouldn't testify. And he got backup today from the Senate Majority Leader, from Mitch McConnell.
Of course he did.
Who on the Senate floor said, time to move on. But I think you can't underestimate how significant it was that the attorney general came out and gave that press conference an hour before it was released to the public, even if the public read a few pages, right? What they heard first was from the attorney general.
Mike Schmidt, any predictions or any reporting about the state of a Mueller hearing on Capitol Hill? Is that something we're likely to see this month?
I mean, it's out there. The Democrats really want it to happen. There's a date out there this weekend about the middle of the month. I think at some point we're going to hear from Mueller. Maybe it takes some time. Maybe it takes some other events. But I find it hard to believe that Mueller will not testify. If he is as, frustrated, as the reporting shows, you could see where he'd want to get out there. At the same time, Mueller is not a person to go out there and really air differences publicly. So, who knows? But
just to follow up on that point, you've reported on 2 letters that he wrote to this attorney general. He was uncomfortable with the public discourse, if not, and the Justice Department spin was the media conversation about it. But there was something out there in this period before his report was public. Any sense that the Justice Department dug themselves a hole by trying to spin too hard?
I don't know. There's few examples in Mueller's life, if any, where he has gone out and aired differences publicly and really taken someone on in sort of the similar, in ways that Comey did, or the way that Comey has testified publicly and sort of laid things out. And that's just not Mueller's style. So I find it hard to believe at the end of his career he would do something differently in terms of that. At the same time, if his team is really upset and he really feels like there was some injustice here in the way that this was unraveled, then you could see him maybe coming out and saying more publicly.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.